better. Slightly.
I think it's just as one total like the rest of it's like 4,000.
It's like 3,000.
300 comes too soon.
Not yet.
Oh. Between 12 now. 6,000 shower and broken 1,000.
Alright. Nice.
Nice.
Nice. Okay, one.
Broken 1,000. And then it's supposed to be few 1,000 broken 2,500.
1 p.m.
No, just in general.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Just at tempo until 1, it's broken 1,000. And then it's very light northwesterly. Or northwesterly to east. The showers are in tomorrow morning. 30 kilometers reducing 10 kilometers to south.
Yeah. Ancillary.
I need a nap
Like-
already.
Additional.
I'm getting hungry.
I might go have a look at your Airbnb.
I'm familiar. I'm just hungry. I'm getting real hungry. I get hungry. Do we get mass briefs?
Providing necessary support to the primary
It's
activity operation.
lunchtime.
Look at how big this horizontal stable is.
So it's, yeah. Providing necessary support for a person whose work provides necessary support to primary activities of
Oh, is
organizations.
that
So yeah, it's like flaps and slats and slots. That's not
Assisting.
flaps.
Assist. Do we do mass briefs?
I feel like
I forgot if we
combining
did mass
sentence but
briefs.
also not letting it out.
I know.
I feel like I'm missing out.
I mean, some of our like lots and lots, the other ones are actually nothing.
And I'm like going from like these are going to be intense. Like this side is
I
going to
don't
be
remember
Yeah, I think what I'll do is I'll like
teaching the effects of
make a digital
controls
copy
there.
too of all these and then write
I just wanted to remember you were in
right next to like on my computer.
Yeah, I think it just wasn't like, it wasn't specifically like
To get
the whole
the-
class
yeah,
thing.
to get
It was like.
I said it, yeah, I said it now, but also.
Right, so like your instructor and another
I'm
instructor.
just going to keep mine as this one now.
Like,
We
usually
just
was
did it in
like-
a flight. So we had the hour and a half before, and we just talked
And it was just a
about
time of having 2 hours before your flight.
Yeah, 2 hours before, and you talked about it, and you hopped in the plane and you do it. That's it.
It's kind of
I'm
funny
like,
though how it
"Two
went from
hours."
being like,
Okay.
like most of the part
That'd
one,
be
it was
good.
like, oh, I come out 2 hours before, okay, now you've done it enough, only an hour and a half. And then as soon as we started doing that, it's like, yeah, you should come in 2 hours before again.
And then
That was on
we did it
schedule.
in half.
It's got an aircraft.
Like
so-
Yeah, a lot of the stuff was covered in half, so we didn't really have to cover it in the next brief. But also, half was a lot more
Like palm
in
on palm.
detail.
I don't remember. It's been too long.
Yeah.
I have to be there at 7 because of the stupid new rule.
Oh, I think I've been taken off your flight
Yeah, I saw that.
because I've got a fake flight on.
Rip.
Do you want as well, Ron?
No.
Oh,
I need to put on availability in for tomorrow morning though.
oh yeah.
Just in case I decide to like, just kidding, you're extreme flying today. And I'm like, sorry, I got told last minute that I'm unavailable.
Psych. So who's your team then? Is it Michael's?
It's nobody.
Oh yeah.
I assume Michael's busy though.
So, I know. I think he said it might be free. What time is it? Is it still that
I'm trying to think they're
8:30?
trying to plan
So you can't go until 7.
But
But that's
I
only-
need
is
to
that
double check my
weekends or
house because I'm
just-
still really
was that
confused.
weekday
Every time I
and
add it
weekends or
up,
just-
I think
it's either
the
2
whole time.
or it's like 2.4 or 2.6.
So dumb if it is.
Just like.
If I overfly, I overfly.
That's
Yeah,
right.
it's fun.
And if I have like 0.6 or something, I'm just gonna go like to Paraguay and land, and then like, you can fly back or something.
Surely we go.
Because sometimes opposite
Surely. I
Yeah.
It's
so
not
want
too
to
hard.
go.
Like I've gone to Ardmore.
Yeah. Okay.
I so want to go.
I
To
was
places
not.
other than
Ardmore is
nature.
scary, but it's not that scary.
This is uncontrolled, that's it.
Yeah, Ardmore.
I almost more annoying than
It's just-
menacing.
Yeah.
No sure.
It's like you just try and do something so that. No, I'm not doing it.
Isaac Lee.
Oh. Fuck that. You ask you stuff. Okay. I don't know if I have two. Was that similar to one of yours? Yeah. Guess you'll sleep in this one. And then you send me a picture. Or a video. He just wants the room so bad. I saw Molly already put her back.
You could actually.
I have no keys.
Just take the
But
keys.
Got
we
land
need
my
to
keys back.
then
Little keys,
we would need like
Got my
probably
keys.
need a remote key.
Yeah.
But I'm sure
Are you gonna join it?
Or the end would be happy.
Did you fix the
If
controls?
they're going to be a party, that's fine. They're not going away or anything like that.
Oh, Matt printed this off for you. And
Because we can go up on the stay until.
yeah, really.
But I did. He's my father.
I'm gonna go have
Well,
a chat.
there'll be a few, Phil.
Excuse me.
There'll be a few.
There was also.
Do you not see my written up?
Yeah.
I'm
Okay, well, like,
specifically
Wait,
asked.
oh.
Well, what, we can see who did it.
Like it's put up.
Daryl.
Wait, how do you second one?
We'll just have to see soon.
Why?
That's fine.
If you talk to Ian, I think I'm fine with Jesus.
That's funny. I can't even visualize myself doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would love to see that. I'd love to see that. It makes me super angry.
We have to the plan we take this and just
I
bring
mean,
out.
if we can't, then I'm gonna buy a new one.
No. Oh, maybe my siblings, but like not in a.
That's what my dad used to do. Oh, we should try.
Not like causing damage.
Come down.
Oh, okay.
But it wasn't in a row?
No.
It's just not what cares about, but it's just happiness and joy, not
Everyone's
violence.
It's,
It's like love to all.
Should we take the 20?
you're not wrong though.
It's not current in that thing.
No, you too well.
And
I want to.
It's quite funny.
Like proposes to you and you're watching him do it. and
I
then
want to, but I
after
cannot.
this, Like if
I
two of
have
them
no
pass,
idea.
like 20 minutes for each of them.
That's not bad.
I
Safety pilot.
I screwed down, like, super hours.
Demons.
I'm so hungry.
So,
I haven't been on one. So.
me too.
I know, I forgot how much fun it was. See, the only thing that makes me not want to be a twin instructor is the fact that
Thanks,
Yeah,
it's fun.
It's so boring.
It's real nice here.
I want to be.
And I didn't have to.
Just because I know
Yeah,
it's
just
not.
focus on the one that you're supposed
It's
to.
just
You're supposed to
in-
have terrible
Yeah,
futures with that, because if you're only doing like part three, part four,
Yes,
it's not so bad.
Because they already like kind of know what they're doing.
You guys have lectures
Pretty
for
much they can do whatever they want to do. Just like, this is your responsibility now. And then the twins like, okay, let's just make some slight
And you have
adjustments.
Fridays, you
Fine,
got
that's fine.
She'll be injured.
Is Tegan hitting somewhere today?
She's leaving last night.
She's
It's
off.
so fun
She's off.
how,
Because I saw it. She's.
No.
how now we just, we
As we saw
simulate
this
on
little
the
trailer,
outside.
you know, parked outside of the house, remember? So we were driving to school, Michael said, oh, blue.
Twins fun.
Oh,
The
I was
fun
not
stuff-
paying
Not
attention.
all the guys are emergencies.
I was
Yeah, they're a bit
messaging a
extra.
group chat.
Oh, yeah, yeah, because the
I
day
guess
it was just
neither.
riding with the big trailer.
I honestly, I
Just
just go through the
take
QRH
stuff.
revised, because I don't remember how to do anything.
Goodbye.
Yeah, that's the part I don't remember.
But it's again, it's one of
Which
those
is some
ones,
people are
like
really.
now, you never use that kind of stuff.
You got turning?
Or very rarely, the thing that you end up
Yeah.
using, you have to bring the QRH over.
Apparently, yeah.
You know, it's like
She
the
loves
alternate
today.
issue. Or it was like.
But she was obviously, she said,
Bugs Laura.
Let's bring in the QRH.
It takes like 2 hours.
What's most important is injury.
I don't know. I
And
It's
had
it's something that you know,
conversations
because you've done it so often.
Like both sides, I'm like,
I mean, I was a bit slow when I did it with
Yeah.
J's.
It's
my
weird.
foot, like,
I'm just
not
like,
because I haven't done
I feel like both
I want to
sides,
like hear the gossip, I'm gonna say it.
both sides want to be involved, I don't want to be involved. Every time I talk to either one, the other one tries to pull up.
I was Zach and he was like, how was your extended trip?
So it was fantastic, dude.
I think it was
It wasn't extended enough.
No, we should have
You're
done.
not
Honestly, I
wrong.
should have. We should have just gone to the pre-flight on the day we left. And been like, oh, what's that oil on the ground?
Oh.
Oh no.
A wing.
Oh, fuck, guess we're gonna have to stay an extra day.
This screw just appears on the ground. And you just think it's just like a massive bolt that's clearly not from the DA40.
They could have had Princess for another day.
Pretty on that away that time. Could have taken a trip to Twizel. Go see it.
Oh, the lights are not
Keep my
working.
answers ready. It wasn't in there.
Punch the light, no. I will try that in
Oh, the
24
tires
business
flat.
hours.
The
It's
tires.
so weird seeing
Was there a hole in the tire? No.
these systems
Can I see a
like
picture?
making crashes. It's a fish in
I,
the Oh my god.
What are you doing?
Oh my god.
We experienced some
What?
ice
I
on
should.
the sunny
I come back and back.
so we cannot continue.
I'd love to be living in Christchurch.
I'm kind of glad I haven't gotten, well, I'd say I haven't gotten stuck here, but I got stuck in Pram for like,
Oh
was
yeah,
it,
we
how long
did.
did it, 4 hours or something?
That was a long time.
That was
What a good place to get stuck.
The
That was
what was like, I forgot what that guy's name was, like, anyways, like, or the briefing officer that came.
I don't know. We're not there.
Oh, he was such a nice man. It's like,
Pretty
I was like,
boring.
oh, when you're in army, it's so terrible. It's like, oh, when is it?
that final?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that was just like.
It's pretty bad.
Wow. Oh my god.
Yeah, why would they be?
How's your flight going, guys? Yeah? Still moving it?
No.
Moving inside?
No.
Wait, are you moving? Is he gonna come or not?
No.
Pull the road?
I said Jamie.
Who's gonna pull the road?
Yeah, well, it's moving, but-
Ah, yeah. Yeah, it's not that cool.
Yeah, we found him sleeping on the floor this morning. One of them.
I like your shit.
Alright, we all here? Sorry about that, I got rudely waylaid by an examiner. So, effects of ancillary controls, like I said, could be done after a short break from effects of primary controls, could just as easily be done on a different day and time. Okay, that's your discretion, but it also depends on how the organisation does these lessons as well. Like I said, in Hawera, we did effects of controls as one lesson on one day, and then ancillary controls was a completely separate thing on another day, so a new briefing. Again, assess previous experience, ask lots of questions, because they may have already done this lesson. So if they have, that again makes your life a lot easier, and you don't have to teach, you just have to ask appropriate questions. Probably about 30 minutes, I would say. It'll take me a little bit longer just as we talk about some of these instructional things as we go through it. You might like to ask a few questions about the primary effects of controls as a bit of a lead into this, because in this lesson you're consolidating on what they learned last time, as you do with all lessons. So when you're actually teaching this lesson in the air, normally you begin by analysing the use of the primary controls. So it might be helpful, particularly if this is a pre-flight briefing, to just brush over some of that, ask a few questions. You don't have to draw the whole table up again, but just gauge, has what you've taught them previously actually sunk in, because sometimes it doesn't. What is meant by ancillary controls? What are they for our aircraft? Do you guys know? Sorry? Flaps?
Like the engine slipstream?
That's not an ancillary control, it's an effect.
Okay, like trim?
True, yep. Any others? There is one more.
It's the throttle, isn't it?
Correct. The throttle is an ancillary or secondary control as well. So as an introduction to this, actually talk about what is an ancillary control. What do we mean by that? It's an additional or a secondary control in our aeroplane. And these are the three that we have. So mention that. That's quite important. This lesson's really about, or goes into more detail about the things that affect the ease with which the pilot can maneuver the controls and to maintain a given attitude. So that's kind of the theme for this lesson. Here are our objectives. To experience the effects of airspeed, slipstream, and power in flight, because all of these things affect the effectiveness of the flight controls, the feel of them, what the pilot experiences when they go to move these control surfaces through the cockpit controls. And also we'll look at to experience the effects of operating the aircraft's ancillary controls in flight, to learn their effects and how they affect the flight and how they can be used appropriately in flight as well. What happens when we use them? So again, you're just expanding on that slightly. The next slide is going to be about airspeed. So remember, in the effects of controls, you taught them a little bit about airspeed. So before you open up the next slide, in fact, let's just have a look at what comes up when you do another click. That's all right, so you can click without bringing up any more answers. Ask them a few questions around airspeed. Usually I ask the question, let's say, I have to sit down, sorry, I've got to really sort back. I usually ask a question like, let's say we go sit in one of the DA40s in the hangar there, okay? So there's no airflow going over the controls. Now if you put all your hands and feet on the controls and do this, what's going to happen? Is the aeroplane going to respond? No, it's not. So the effectiveness of the controls depends upon the airspeed, the speed of the air that's flowing over those surfaces. So if we were to go, and the reason I said in the hangar was because if we were to go sit in that aircraft that's uncovered over there at the moment, and you were to do the same thing, is there going to be a response from the aeroplane? Right now?
Maybe a little one.
A little one, yeah. There's just enough airspeed probably to get a small response from the aeroplane. So use that to highlight it. You're probably not going to get anything from the rudder or the ailerons, but it's the elevator that usually is quite effective. So you can show that when you go and sit in there. Just rock the stick back and forward and point out to them, hey look, even though the wind is really light, the nose is trying to pitch up and down a little bit there. So the point is, the faster we go, the more effective the controls become. So airspeed increases the effectiveness, and what this means to the pilot is smaller inputs will be required on these cockpit controls to actually maneuver the aeroplane. How the controls feel will change as well. You will find they feel heavier, more force is required to move the controls. Less movement is required to have the desired effect. What about if we reduce the airspeed? So by this point you're really just summarising. As the airspeed reduces, the controls lose their effectiveness, and you'll find that you need to use bigger and bigger inputs to actually get the aeroplane to respond in the way that you want it to. The controls will feel sluggish. Really emphasise some of those words, because if we're really being honest, it's not always very evident, just the loss of the effectiveness of the controls when you teach this out in the lesson. So you really need to exaggerate at some points in this lesson. So use those words. So why is this important to understand? I would say to you, this is probably the biggest fault when I see people present this briefing, is they never tell the students why they need to know all of this stuff. You know, why do they need to know about airspeed, slipstream, power, trim, flap? We have to convey that, otherwise this lesson means nothing. So I'll pose a question to you guys. Why do we need to know about the effective airspeed?
So we know how much control input we need to put in with various airspeed.
Yep. So it's about anticipating how the aircraft will handle at different speeds. So always relate it to a practical scenario. So imagine we're lined up on the runway for takeoff. We've just got airborne. Airspeed's quite low. So quite large inputs are required at that low speed to actually get the aeroplane to respond. The controls will feel a bit more sluggish. But when we've leveled off in cruise, or we're in a descent at 120 knots, 130 knots, those controls are going to feel heavier and more effective. Smaller inputs will be required to have the desired effect. So it actually gives some practical reasons and phases of flight where this is relevant. Otherwise, is pointless. Another example is landing. And when you actually teach this lesson, I talk to them about all of that stuff when we're coming into land. You go out to the training area, you show them the effective airspeed, you talk them through it, but then when you come back and land, actually you continue to talk about it. Hey, so airspeed's now slowing down to land. I'm having to use much bigger elevator inputs here, much bigger aileron inputs. You've talked about power out there as well, so we're at low power settings, so there's not as much slipstream. You relate it to practical stuff. I can't tell you how important that actually is, and when I look back at how I was trained, that stuff was missed entirely. I was not taught that, and I think I mentioned earlier, deny that. That leads to a bad attitude developing in students, and it's not even their fault. If you haven't done a good enough job in telling them why they need to know it, then that's on you. Now there's another impact of speed, and that is slipstream. So briefly describe what that is. So the propeller's like a fan, except the propeller throws the air backwards over the controls, curls around the aircraft like that, but it also acts in a bit of a cone shape. And you'll see there that some of the controls lie inside that slipstream effect. So ask them what controls they are. You don't need to tell them. Obviously the elevator and the rudder. So what does this mean? The point is that this airflow here is accelerated faster than the airflow you find at the wingtips. If the airflow is faster here, what happens to the control effectiveness of the elevator and the rudder? See how you can lead them through that without even having to tell them that the controls will be more effective when there's more power set? That's the way it should be done. You don't need to do all the work. Let them have the opportunity to figure things out yourself. But what about the ailerons? They're outside the slipstream effect, so they remain relatively ineffective. So what does all of this mean? It means whenever we're at high power setting, the slipstream effect will be higher, and those two controls will be more effective. We won't need to use as larger inputs. So let's talk about climbing shortly after takeoff. We've actually got a relatively low speed in that situation, but because we've got high power, elevator and rudder will be quite effective. But if we want to roll to turn out towards the training area, ailerons are going to be quite ineffective, so much bigger aileron inputs will be required. Now what about coming into land? We've got a relatively low power setting, so low power setting, slipstream effect reduces. Now all the controls will feel less effective, because not only are we slow, we've also got low power setting. So talk through that, okay? Again, keep it practical. So your link from the airspeed to the slipstream is that slipstream is really still about airspeed, isn't it? So you carry on and talk a little bit more about slipstream. So slipstream comes from power, and there are a few additional effects of power. This is just summary. We talked about all of this. See how it's easy to get ahead of yourself? I didn't do a very good job of that. Here we go. So there's a couple more effects of using power. So before I mentioned that the slipstream curls around the aircraft, thrown backwards by the propeller. And this slipstream, this spiraling air, meets the vertical stabilizer on the left-hand side. So what this is going to mean is whenever we increase the power, or we're operating at a high power setting, there will be an increased force on the left-hand side of the vertical stabilizer. So hold the model and show them that. So my finger represents the force increasing. Let's have a look what happens. The aeroplane yaws to the left. So increasing power increases the slipstream and causes yaw to the left. Now you'll notice this during the takeoff roll. So here's the practical bit, right? You'll notice this in the takeoff roll. So when you go through to full power, the aeroplane is going to want to yaw off into the grass on the side of the runway. Now, how are you going to stop it doing that? That's something they should know, because you taught them in effects and controls what the effect and the purpose of the rudder was for. So let's hope they actually say, with the rudder, okay? You don't need to tell them that unless they're too shy to answer, as sometimes happens. Now the next part you've got to talk about is the pitching up. So I like to start with the runway because that's where the start of the flight begins, right? So we're going to get the yaw there, but the nose isn't going to pitch up. But what about now we're in the southern training area, we've levelled off and you increase the power. So as expected, the aircraft's going to yaw to the left, as we've just talked about, but the nose is also going to pitch up now. Now they're not going to know why, so what's the answer to the why?
The thrust drag moment, or the slight negative angle of the tail plane.
I'm a brand new student. You want to talk about moments and negative angles, do you? What would be a different way? You know, you're correct, but let's bring it down a level to a brand new student. What could we say?
You know, those like really fast hot rod cars when they put all the power on, they start, you know,
Yep.
the nose like goes up.
Yep.
Could you compare it to that, or is that a bit different?
You could do, but you've got to explain why it happens. To keep it simple, I usually just say when you increase power, push forward on the throttle, it increases the thrust, and the way that this behaves, or probably behaves is the best word, the way that this behaves in relation to the other forces is it causes the nose to pitch up. That is all you need to go into. If a student really wants to dig into it, then you might have to draw a diagram and show how the forces all act. Not necessary though for a basic understanding. You've got to have that background knowledge to explain it if you need to, but I just say that. So thrust increases, and how that acts in relation to the other forces will cause the nose to pitch up. You know, I've used my phone for a few students before, so what do we say? We say the drag line's high and the thrust line's low, don't we? So if my phone represents the aeroplane and we're travelling through the air like that, if I increase the thrust, we're saying the thrust line's down here, that's going to cause the nose to pitch up. So you can get inventive like that if you want, or use the aircraft model. There are different ways of doing things. So then, reducing power is going to be the opposite, right? So you don't have to spell this out all again. You can just summarize by saying reducing power will be the opposite, or what do you think then will happen if we reduce power? Hopefully now they've understood it to know that the aeroplane's nose will pitch down. So that's because of what you're doing to the thrust. You're reducing thrust, and the aeroplane will yaw to the right because you are reducing the slipstream effect. So if you're reducing this force here, now the aeroplane's going to yaw back in the opposite direction. So why do we need to know about that? Directional control during takeoff, but again, this response from the aeroplane, this pitching up or down, is undesirable. So we need to anticipate this whenever we change the power settings. So if we're in straight level flight for cruising to somewhere and we want to reduce the power or increase the power, we've got to prevent these adverse effects. We've got to prevent the yaw. We've got to prevent the nose from pitching. So ask the student questions on how would you do that. The rudder and the elevator, right? That's where you're heading with this. Why is it important? Imagine we're cruising along at, on the boundary of controlled airspace at 1,500 feet, and you increase the power. What's going to happen? The nose is going to pitch up and you're going to enter airspace without permission. What about if you're on a navigation flight, a student's early navigation flight, and you increase the power and the aeroplane yaws and subsequently rolls, you're no longer going to be maintaining your flight planned heading. So give some practical examples of why this is even relevant for the student to know. The trim, just one more note on that. Be very careful when you describe the ancillary controls, in particular the throttle. It is the throttle that is ancillary control, not the power. The power is an effect. Okay, slipstream is an effect. It is the throttle that is the ancillary control. The trim. This is another one of our ancillary controls. This it used to be called a poor man's autopilot, believe it or not. And what this allows the pilot to do is, having set a particular nose attitude with the elevator and holding that with pressure on the stick, the pilot can then move this little trim tab, which is this little tab on the back of the elevator here, and that's connected to the cockpit through a series of cables to a wheel. The pilot can move that. and in moving that, the pilot can eliminate all the forces on the stick, and the aircraft nose attitude will remain constant. So you could tell a bit of a story with that. In fact, I could probably backtrack and tell a story on that if I'm honest. So imagine we're going to Napier direct from Palmerston North. We've decided we want to climb up to 7,500 feet today. We've taken off and having to pull the stick back to hold the nose attitude there in the climb. It's getting tiring, it's getting annoying. We might need to briefly take our hand off the stick to retrieve something from the back. We can't do that if we aren't trimmed. So what the pilot can do is, having set the attitude and holding it with elevator, they can now trim. If you are holding back pressure on the stick, you need to trim back. If you are pushing forward on the stick, you need to trim forward. So you're just describing what that means, winding the wheel forward or backwards. Also mention to them, as they get closer to the trimmed position, they should feel the forces on the stick reduce to the point where they're completely eliminated, and they should be able to just have a couple of fingers on the stick, and that's all they need. Now obviously if the force is getting stronger, then they've trimmed the wrong way. What you need to make very clear to the student is they do not change the attitude with the trim. Okay, it is select, hold, then trim. And as they are trimming, they need to hold the attitude with elevator. So what they tend to do is they forget about actually keeping the attitude constant, and all of a sudden the nose pitches up or it pitches down, and they're no longer at the correct attitude. So they've got to go back to the start, select again, hold, then trim. So be really disciplined with your critique of them that they do not use it to change the attitude, it is only to maintain it. So we have what is known as a variable elevator trim on the elevator. Some aeroplanes, like the twin-engine one, have one on the rudder, so you can just briefly summarise with something like that. Here's that trim wheel I mentioned in the cockpit, so highlight that to them. So if you're pushing forward on the stick, in order to keep the attitude constant, you need to trim forward by winding the wheel forwards until you feel all the pressures on the stick have eliminated, and all you need is a couple of fingers. If you are pulling back, I'll talk through that process, okay? So there's a manual trim, that one is, and then there's an electronic trim on your stick as well. If you push both of the little black knobs there forward, it trims the aircraft's nose forward. And if you pull both of them back towards you with your thumb, then it will trim the nose up. So why do we use the trim? My summary is to make flying the airplane easier, reduce workload. Right, our last ancillary control, flaps. So to start off with, just briefly describe where the flaps are, give a little bit of information on the DA40, what type of flaps they are. You could also mention that. So we've got plain split flaps or simple split flaps on the DA40. When you do your taxiing lesson with them with fixed controls, you also demonstrate to them a pre-flight of the aeroplane. So you pointed these out to them potentially already, so they should know where the flaps are. They are operated electrically in a DA40, and there's a couple of different settings. There's takeoff, landing, and then up. What do the flaps do? They change the shape of the wing, the camber. Remember we talked about this in fixed controls. So you could lead into this next point by asking them, what happened to lift when we increase the camber. Your next click's going to bring up the answer, so just sort of think about that before you get ahead of yourself. Hopefully they remember, oh yeah, increasing camber increases the lift. So why is this beneficial? This is where I talk a little bit about why we use flaps. We use flaps to increase lift to allow the aeroplane to take off and land at lower speeds. It means we don't need as much runway. Simple as that, okay? Don't go into any more detail. Obviously, there are more reasons why we use flap, but really, that's the main one, isn't it? To shorten the takeoff and landing distance. Flaps also increase drag, so that can also help us out with shorter landing distances as well. You do not need to give too much information. We're not teaching the package on the effects of flaps. We're just teaching the very basic practical things of why we use flaps. There are a few operating speeds we need to be careful of before we extend flap. So we have VFE, the flap extension speeds. Those are shown on the airspeed indicator, the standby airspeed indicator, as a white arc, and on the electronic airspeed indicator is a white range of speeds. Are they for the takeoff flap or are they for the landing flap only? Yeah, so just mention that to them. So we have 108 knots as the maximum speed for extension of the takeoff flap and 91 knots for the landing flap. I like to mention to the students as well, either here or in the pre-flight briefing, that don't extend the flap right at those speeds, because all it takes is a little gust and all of a sudden you've exceeded the flap speed. Always wait for the airspeed to be well below that, and 5 knots might be suitable, but also that the airspeed is trending down, because it's really, as you know, it's really easy to overspeed the landing flap, right? Particularly on final. How many times have you gone to extend it and only to realise that the airspeed's actually 85 or 87 knots? A new student's going to find that even more difficult. So this shows the flap being extended. So we've got the plain simple flap. So when you extend the flap, the camber increases, which increases the lift. This is showing a comparison of what the camber is like when the flap is raised and when the flap is extended. So the green line shows the camber when the flap is raised. And do we have an animation for the next bit? We do. And the yellow line shows the camber when the flap is extended there in the landing position. Much more camber, so much more lift is produced, allowing us to fly slower. Instructional technique. Watch the terminology you use for describing using the flap. I do not want to hear deploy flap. If I hear deploy flap, you owe me a beer or two. Particularly my students, if I hear any of that in flight. We don't deploy flap. We set or we extend flap, we raise flap or we retract flap. I'll accept any of those terms, but never deploy. It's interesting, the things that come out of people's mouths. All right, so aircraft management, we talked a little bit about flap speed limits already, so if you hadn't expanded on that back slide about maximum speeds for flap extension and making sure you're well below those speeds, then do that here. Otherwise, it might be just an opportunity for questions. We've talked about the I have control, you have control stuff before. So here's an opportunity for you to ask a question about this. So pose a scenario to your students, say they are in control and they want to hand the controls back to you. Ask them about how they would go about doing that. So get them to describe the terminology and also what they're doing with their hands and feet, okay? Questions, that's all that's needed there. We've talked about the seating position and rudder pedal position, so here ask them the question, so what did you sit on last time in that flight? Did you sit on any cushions? How many? Was it the soft ones or the thicker ones? How close did you have the pedals? All the way back towards you or was it all the way further away? Ask those questions, because you want them to start thinking about that themselves, so that every time you go flying, you don't have to keep checking that for them. There isn't a point on the slide, but have a chat about this diagram here as well. So the flap speeds are placarded, but you expect the student to memorize those speeds and to make sure they're checking that the airspeed is not any higher than these speeds before they extend the flap. And you can talk about what the lights mean. So, you know, this is indicating the flap is in the takeoff position. What would it look like if it was in the landing position? What would it look like if the flaps were up? Okay, just talk them through those indications on this slide. Human factors in airmanship. Again, you could ask questions here. What does human factors in airmanship mean to you? It gets to a point where you can stop asking that question, but remember this is potentially only the second or third briefing, so it's still a valid question. Or you could ask a specific question about human factors. You know, what do you think about before you decide to come in for a flight every day? Something like that. Or, hey, what did the F stand for in the I'm safe acronym? But you certainly don't need to keep going through this. Do it once, and wherever it first appeared, was it taxiing or was it effects controls? And then you don't have to keep going through it thereafter. This next point is new, the clock code. So like I said in the previous briefings, you are gradually handing the control of lookout over to your student, the more experience they get. So here's the time to introduce what the clock code is. So it's a way of identifying an aircraft's position in relation to you. It's used for separation purposes when we're out in the training area, because when we're out in the training area, it can be busy. Sometimes there's other aircraft around us. We can use this clock code to ensure that we actually stay separated. So you could, for this, do a few different examples. You could draw a diagram on the board if you want, or you could just pick on a particular student and talk through the what position are you in. You know, if Warren is my student and he could see me and he's making a radio call, he's got to tell me what position I am in relation to him. Remember, you've got to tell the pilot from their point of view. There's no point Warren saying, oh yeah, you're in my 11 o'clock position. Well, that's nice, you know, I've got to do maths now and figure out what's the reciprocal of 11 o'clock. I can't do that. A new student can't do that. So it's got to be for them. Okay, so yeah, Massey 28, have you in sight at your 5 o'clock or whatever it is. So you can position yourself at different places around the room with different students and actually run through that, okay? Remember, it is based on the nose of the aeroplane as well, right in front of you. You could also add high or low to that as well. Massey 28, you're in, I'm in your 5 o'clock high position. And then I can relax a little bit, because if I'm lower than them, it's not an immediate concern for a conflict. So that can be added as well. This is just a recap on a few things. So you could ask questions around, hey, how do we put some air conditioning on? How do we put the heater on? Question them on that. So here at Massey, obviously we do have pilot monitoring, and it's important that you start to develop their responsibilities of making sure the passenger in the back is fine. So this is where you can start talking about that stuff. If you're out in the industry learning in a 152 or a Tomahawk 2-seater, that's obviously not going to be as much of a consideration for you. So the air exercise, this should largely be questions, okay? There's not much in the air exercise for ancillary controls that you're going to have to teach. So I'll bring it up and we'll just talk about it. That's all that comes up on this slide. So ask questions about, hey, what happens to the controls when we fly fast? How will they feel? What about when we fly slow? How will they feel? Why do you need to know that? Come back to those questions that you've already asked. Do the same with slipstream. Do the same with power. Nothing you need to teach here, provided you've done it all in the previous slides. Trim. Again, maybe set a scenario. So let's say you've been on a flight to Capri Island or whatever, and now you're coming back to Palmy and you need to do quite a long descent. So you've pitched the nose down, but you're feeling you've got to keep holding that stick forward in order to hold the nose into a descent. What will you do about this? So get them to talk through that. How will you know when the aeroplane is in a trimmed position? Flaps, really the lift and drag should be not in the air exercise part, but you could ask them the question here, hey, what do flaps do to lift and drag? Yep, they increase lift and increase drag. Now this is the new bit here, is what is the response from the aeroplane? So when you lower the flap, extend the flap, whatever terminology you want to use there, the nose is going to pitch up, and the airspeed will slow down. Once the airspeed slowed down somewhat, the nose will pitch back down again. If I had my way, I would just actually get rid of the down part, because what we're really wanting to teach a student is the initial effect of extending the flap. The nose does pitch up and the airspeed does start to slow down. Just an instructional technique note here, when you are teaching this to your students, make sure you do extend the flap at a reasonably high speed. Now, obviously watch your flap extension speeds, but don't let the aeroplane slow to 80 knots before you extend your takeoff flap, because, and my students and I will look at this, the nose does not pitch up anymore. It barely moves, and in fact it pitches down a little bit. Don't go there, okay? That does not support what you've just taught your student in this mass breed. If you're at a relatively high speed, the nose always pitches up in this aeroplane. What about when we raise the flap? The opposite happens, so the nose will pitch down and the aircraft starts to sink, the airspeed increases. So the really important here is, why do you care about this? Firstly, when you go to raise the flap, typically that is done when you're close to the ground. Shortly after takeoff, we raise the takeoff flap. And what's the response? The airplane's nose is going to pitch down, it's going to sink. That means we're going to get closer to the ground. That's not good. So what can we do to minimize that sink, to make sure raising flap is always safe? A couple of rules, you need to call them rules if you like. We always raise flap at full power, because that can minimize, if not eliminate, the sink that we get. We always make sure that we're at a safe height, so that if and when the airplane does sink, we're not going to hit trees or any terrain. And we always raise the flap in stages, never all the flap in one go. So if we've got a landing flap extended, we just raise takeoff flap, pause for a few seconds, and then raise the landing flap. And that can also minimize the sinking, can minimize the pitch change that happens as well. And of course the other rule is at a safe airspeed. So we don't want the airspeed to be reducing. You don't introduce the terminology stall here, because I don't know anything about that. Just mention those rules of thumb. And that is the ancillary control lesson. So it builds on what they learned in primary effects, so make sure you do build on it as well. Come back to what they learned in that previous lesson. You do not need to spell out all the answers for them. Now let's see, are there any additional things I need to tell you? Another way of describing the effective airspeed, to sort of come back to the lift package, is remember how we talked about sticking your hand out of the window at, or it might be the drag package, I suppose, sticking your hand out of the window and feeling how that force changes. You could describe the effective airspeed like that as well. So, hey, when you were little, do you remember sticking your hand out of the car when you were in town 50 kilometres an hour? Bit of a force there, wasn't there? But what about when you're 100 kilometres an hour? It's a big force. So you can use things like that as well. It's just another method of doing what I described. No, that's everything. I've covered it all. Yeah, so that's those three briefings. So next, is it Friday you're presenting? Yeah. So who's presenting on Friday? No, anyway, you can look at that thing up here and figure it out. I think there's two dual briefings. I think there's climbing and descending and straight lawn climbing and descending. So I'll deliver those, and Jess will deliver those. And I don't know how many solo briefings there are, 1 or 2, but it'll be taxiing most likely. So don't go crazy with your study on these mass briefs right now. Like I said, do that after at least one of the solo presentations has been given, because then you will have the benefit of hearing the feedback from the instructor. Okay. Yeah, so pull more of your stuff in later. I think that's everything we need to talk about.